Welcome to our latest edition of ShiftED podcasts. Today we're going to be talking with Ian Shanahan from The Green Teacher. We're going to kind of touch on a whole bunch of subject areas kind of revolving around the outdoors and how we can use the outdoors as our classroom a little bit more and getting our students outside and learning. We had a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. I'd like to thank you, Ian, for coming and having a little chat with us about, and I think we're going to kind of talk about some outdoor experiences. And here in Quebec, we've been really expanding our outdoor will in education. And teachers are more and more curious about it, but they haven't yet taken the leap to say, okay, I'm going to do it. So I thought it would be interesting to talk to you about your experiences of how do you encourage teachers and kind of get that outdoor spirit going. For the first time, the Quebec government actually put a note in their revitalization plan after COVID had set in and we started to go back to schools that they wanted teachers to take kids outside more. And this was the first time that we've ever seen this language coming from the ministry. So I dove in and it has brought me to you. So
fantastic.
Why don't we start with just like, where did your interest start in with environmental education? Like where did that all begin for you?
Yeah, I grew up in a rural area in southeastern Ontario, so right on the north shore of Lake Ontario itself, and had a lot of exposure to just being outdoors, a lot of unstructured time outdoors and some structured time. I mean, both. My father was a naturalist, so that gave easy access to the outdoors. And then I eventually took after him in becoming a naturalist myself. And then there's a local provincial park, Presqu'île, right in the town where I grew up. And that was the obvious place to go for summer jobs. So I worked as a nature interpreter and a naturalist at that park for many years and numerous other parks in Ontario. And really, outdoor experiential education has been foundational to my life for really my whole life.
Could you define what a naturalist, like what's the types of things you would do in a week or a month? Like what are those kinds of activities you partake in?
Yeah, I mean, a naturalist, I guess by definition, is really just someone who has a keen interest in nature, and that can take many different forms. Someone might be an artist, they might be a photographer, they might collect things, they might document and record what they find. Other people consider a naturalist as somebody who does field work, which can be true. In terms of the jobs that I had with Ontario parks that were designated as naturalist jobs, it was really more on the education side, the nature interpretation, the nature and heritage interpretation, I should say. So translating scientific content into a more digestible, relatable, quote unquote, language.
That's interesting. And what were some of the things that you worked on that you were able to connect the outdoor with the educational world? What were some examples of things that you were working on through the parks?
When I started with Presqu'île Park, I was mainly in their nature center. So they have a fairly, if you imagine a nature center, it was very much as you would expect it. There were some live specimens, lots of dioramas, opportunities for visitors to get their hands dirty and experience nature through various senses. So kind of an entry point to the nature of the park. So I worked quite a bit, especially in my first couple summers when I was in high school. I worked quite a bit in the nature center, spent a bit more time as the years went by and the summers went by doing interpretive programs, so guided walks, children's specific programs, slide presentations, even when we actually used slides pre-PowerPoint. So I'm aging myself a bit. So I did a few of those presentations, but PowerPoint came along soon after and, of course, simplified things quite a lot. So the education, as soon as I started that job, the education was always there, front and center, because the job was about communications with park visitors.
Right. That's really interesting. That's really interesting. And where was this again you were doing? Like where you started in your teen years?
Yeah, it's Presqu'île Park or Presqu'île Peninsula, and it is a peninsula.
Mhm.
And it's on the north shore of Lake Ontario, approximately halfway between Toronto and Kingston, a little bit closer to Kingston, but in that general range. And it's, yeah, a little peninsula on the north shore of the lake that sticks out south into the lake. So it's a migratory hotspot for things like migratory birds and monarch butterflies. And it's a park that's particularly biodiverse. It has 7 to 8, depending on how you define habitats, 7 or 8 very distinct habitats. And in a park that's only, I believe it's about 9 square kilometers, maybe 9 and change, that's pretty remarkable to have
Mhm.
that kind of diversity in such a small space.
Wow. And maybe talking a little bit more from a personal standpoint, like what drew you to the outdoors? Like what were some of the things that caught your passions, and then what kinds of things would you do outside throughout your life?
Definitely just that exposure was huge. And I mentioned my dad was a naturalist, and spending a lot of time outdoors with him. And oftentimes when we went out to do something as a family, it was often outdoors. So I guess by osmosis, I had just so many opportunities to connect with nature and connect with the land and the various plants and animals and fungi and everything else that
Hmm.
occupies the land. So the exposure was huge. And who's to say? I mean, nobody knows what life looks like in a parallel universe if I didn't grow up in that area and I didn't have this father who was so encouraging. Maybe I would have gone down a different path. I'd like to think that I would have found my way there anyways, because even in an urban center, you can still find green spaces. And I think that inherent interest was always there for me. But as with many things, you need to find that spark moment that opens the door. And I just was so privileged to have so many of these opportunities for spark moments. I can give you an example of one particular moment that really stands out. I was
Hmm.
about 12 years old and I was walking along the sand beach at Presqu'île, so the shore of Lake Ontario. I was with my dad, and there were a lot of migratory shorebirds, sandpipers and plovers, just milling around on the beach, feeding on invertebrates. And a peregrine falcon whizzed by at top speed, and this is a bird that can reach 300 miles per hour at top speeds. So this was really impressive, and for whatever reason, it's, who knows why certain moments stick with us more than others, but that one really did stick with me. And it is sort of my life before and my life after were quite different. That's a moment that I always come back to.
That's cool. That's an amazing memory to have, particularly
Yeah,
with your dad.
for sure.
That's amazing. So you're the green teacher. Um, what was the evolution of that? I kind of looked briefly at some of your LinkedIn experiences, which I find pretty amazing. Your trajectory throughout life. But what were some of the steps that brought you to being that, the green teacher?
Yeah, so I mean, Green Teacher is a charitable nonprofit that provides resources for environmental and outdoor education. And because I had worked so many years in parks, I got my teaching degree at the University of Toronto. I was engaged with other organizations in outdoor and environmental education. I did some walks at Evergreen Brickworks in Toronto when I lived in Toronto. That was a lot of fun. And also at the time of living in Toronto, through various connections, was able to find myself to Green Teacher and recognize that they were first and foremost a provider of this quarterly magazine that offers to educators insights, tips, and lessons and activities for outdoor and environmental education. And my wife actually ended up doing an internship with Green Teacher,
Hmm.
and that was the main entry point. And then, as Green Teacher's previous editor was looking to move on to a more executive role, he wanted to find somebody to fill his shoes, so to speak. And
Mhm.
with my educational background, my naturalist background, and my writing and editing background, it just felt like the perfect fit. And
Hmm.
here we are.
Awesome. That's really cool. Really cool. You've kind of mentioned twice these walks. Um, I've been working a lot with teachers and trying to help kind of find it a gateway into outdoor learning. Um, and I was introduced to Gillian Judson and a
Oh,
walking
great.
curriculum, and I just find it again. It was a moment where something kind of clicked in my head and was like, "This is it."
Mhm.
When you talk about a walking curriculum or nature walks, like what's the crux behind them? Do you think for a novice teacher that would be like, I want to start getting out more with my kids. I'm not really sure where to start. How would you fit just going on a simple walk into encouraging teachers to bring their kids out more?
That's such a great question because, I liken this to jumping into the swimming pool or the lake or whatever body of
Mm-hmm.
water. You
Mm-hmm.
dip your toe in and it's a little bit cold and you're like, oh, I don't want to jump in. But if you just fully commit and jump in with all your force, you eventually adjust to it. But getting over that initial barrier is tough. And I think
Mm-hmm.
there are numerous barriers for educators who want to take their learning outside. And I should differentiate between outdoor learning and quote unquote outdoor education.
Mm-hmm.
Outdoor learning, this maybe sounds a bit mundane, but outdoor learning really just is learning that takes place outdoors. Outdoor education, quote unquote, is more specific to getting to know nature and natural history of
Right.
species and ecology, all of which, of course, is an important component of outdoor learning.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is important to make that differentiation because outdoor learning doesn't mean you need to be a naturalist, an ecologist, a scientist, or a science teacher.
Right.
Learning can happen outdoors regardless of the lesson or the subject area. And I mean, should we even have these cordoned off subject areas? Maybe to a certain extent, but a bit
Mm-hmm.
more overlap. I think a lot of people are recognizing the value of having much more overlap among the different subject areas, so to speak. But yeah, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of getting over those barriers, I mean, the weather is a barrier, and there is a certain reality of clothing. I mean, there is that old saying, "There's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothes,"
Right.
and that is true. But do all of your learners have access to those clothes? And that's where maybe a community program where people donate clothing that they don't need, so that you have extra coats
Right.
for the windy days or the cold days or the rainy days, snow, sleet, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is a reality that not all learners have access to the clothing that is needed in all weather conditions. So that's certainly a barrier, and that's coupled in with weather. I know there are often administrative barriers, and on the Earthy Chats podcast that we do with the Outdoor Learning Store, we had a guest on, Juliet Robertson, who's based in the
Mm-hmm.
UK. She wrote the book Messy Maths.
Yeah.
And her quote, and I'm somewhat paraphrasing here, but she said that in her experience teaching, just taking the class out into the schoolyard, not even off site, just onto the schoolyard,
Mm-hmm.
was like escaping from Alcatraz. So there is that reality too. But I think
Yeah.
also getting back to this idea of you don't need to be a naturalist, a biologist, an ecologist, etc. I think a lot of educators with good intentions are just afraid that they don't have the knowledge to
Right.
go outside. So if we're going to learn outside, oh, I need to know all the trees, I need to know all the insects. Now, can that be incredibly useful? Sure.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the work that is happening now in outdoor and environmental education, specifically outdoor learning, is centered on this idea of the teacher as the facilitator and the teacher co-learning with their students.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be really enriching for students and learners. And it kind of levels the playing field too. I mean, the educator is still there as the facilitator, the responsible adult,
Right.
whom you go to if you need something, but they don't necessarily have to be a subject expert, at least not for the first few sessions. I mean, over time, you probably will get to know the names and the natural history of the common plants, animals, birds, mammals on your
Right.
schoolyard or a nearby green space. But yeah, it's all about getting past those barriers, whether they're clothing or weather related, administrative, or that fear of not being an expert. And I guess what I would
Right.
suggest to educators is that it's okay if you look at plants poking up through the sidewalk cracks and you don't know what they are. You can learn that with your students. And of course, there are some great resources out there that can help you do that learning alongside your students.
Absolutely. In that same vein, Ian, what have been some successes for you where you get past those barriers and teachers are ready to do it? What are the kinds of things that they might go outside and do as an initial kind of, jumping into that lake?
Yeah, jumping into that lake. Well, you mentioned Gillian Judson's work in her book, A Walking Curriculum, and I think that book provides an excellent model for activities and learning experiences that educators can explore with their students. And a lot of this is grounded in storytelling principles. And I know the word storytelling, and Gillian speaks quite frequently about this. The term storytelling and imagination, which is another big part of her work, often makes some people think, oh, fairies, magic, young kids read aloud stories. And again, that can be part of it, depending on the age group you're with, depending on the interest of the learners that you're with. But using storytelling principles and using the breadth of your imagination can be incorporated into learning for all grade levels and, again, all subject areas. And it often starts with the questions that learners have. And for this, I point to the great work that Natural Curiosity does. They're another charitable nonprofit associated with the University of Toronto. And their pedagogical book, which is called Natural Curiosity, the second edition of their book, is based on inquiry-based learning. And they've worked in partnership with various Indigenous educators to infuse Indigenous perspectives into that learning as well. So there's the land-based learning piece with that. So yeah, leading with learners' big questions. And it can be as simple as why. Why questions are some of the greatest open-ended questions that can open up these wonderful inquiries where you don't even know where you're necessarily going to end up.
Right.
But that's often the beauty of it. Why is the bark on this particular tree so deeply furrowed? Or these two trees are the same species. Why is one a different height than the other? Why does one have more fungi on it? Why are the fungi on one particular side? I mean, there really can be a snowball effect with the inquiry-based questions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting you said that. We had a webinar yesterday with Judy Halpern from the Learning Sustainable Future.
Yep.
And she presented kind of storybooks, picture books to spur on that inquiry in STEAM related fields. And it was just absolutely fascinating. And one of the things that I picked out was not only it starts by getting kids to think and ask questions into I wonder, but the humor behind it, the hook of books that have to deal with outdoor. And she was suggesting that books are a great way as also an intro to get kind of teachers touching, putting their toe in that cold lake again. And then they don't have to feel like experts. One of our problems in Quebec is a lot of our elementary school teachers are not, considered experts in math or in science and, those STEAM fields. And I think it kind of, they're not sure how to engage with it, how to find their way in through. But I think what you were saying about kind of getting past those barriers that tend to be personal, right? They tend to be teacher struggles with it or trying to figure their way through it. And then I've noticed that some teachers that try off they go, right? It takes like that initial experience and they see their kids in different ways, which I always thought was amazing. If you let the kids lead, the teacher will follow eventually because they'll want to be going outside more once they get the taste of it. Have you ever taken a first class outside and kind of observed the goings on of how the kids react to an initial experience of going outside on a walk or doing some inquiry based learning outside? Have you seen any experiences with initial groups doing that?
For sure. And, of course, every group is different and it often depends on the shared experiences or the individual experiences of the different members of the group. But when I worked up at Algonquin Park in South Central Ontario, just on the south edge of the Canadian Shield, Precambrian rock, I did some school group programs for one fall. And we had quite a few school groups, some from more rural areas and then some from quite urban areas, downtown Toronto.
Right.
And students really do come alive when you give them the opportunity to. I mean, there are certain practical considerations. I mean, it is difficult to be engaged if you're hungry, if you're thirsty, if you're too cold, if you're too hot, and all of those sorts of things. Sure.
Right.
But if all of those things are taken care of and you open the door, a lot of people are their best self outside. And that's a paraphrase that I'm borrowing from Megan Zenny, who we just interviewed for the Earthy Chats podcast and who has presented quite often through the Outdoor Learning Store. And yes, I can certainly anecdotally from my experience, I would agree that a lot of people are their best self outdoors because, being outdoors forces us to make a lot of decisions. And that's why people like Richard Louv speak to the importance of risky play so that young people can develop those skills of resilience, because you're always figuring stuff out. You're always problem solving outdoors because, the tables aren't all flat, so to speak.
Right.
You don't have the air conditioning. You don't have the comforts of home sort of idea. So the discomfort of being outside just opens up so many opportunities for learning, experiencing, building skills and competencies. And
absolutely.
I'm probably preaching to the choir, but
no, it's really fascinating. Yeah, for sure. I think we forget sometimes how I was talking with some teachers too, and we talked about like our memories of play outside, and everybody had these amazing stories and forts they would build in the winter, the forts and the culverts and the mud and a teacher said that she had asked her class, so what do you guys do outside? And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, few have that opportunity outside of school times to actually go and enjoy a natural world, and kind of experience it, that freedom. And also that risk play, as you're saying, I think that is super crucial. So if we kind of had this shift in, I don't know, like it seems like we're less secure about letting our kids go outside. Whereas I remember when I was quite young, I mean, my mom would kick us out and we would be gone until she would scream and yell to get us back into the house. Yeah. And I guess that it's just not the same anymore, right? I mean, it just seems to have shifted a bit where it's more of a school thing now where students have opportunities to go and just kind of play outside.
For sure. And there's so many reasons for it. And, as with everything, it's complicated. I mean, there's the fear of strangers, and that is valid to a certain extent. I mean, still, for the most part, at least in a country like Canada, of course, we do hear about terrible stories on the news, which are extremely sad whenever we hear them.
Sure.
Fortunately, they are really infrequent statistically. That's not to say that we shouldn't exercise caution and be smart, but the outdoors, at least in your neighborhood, usually is quite a safe place, but a lot of people don't see it as a safe place. And that might be for cultural reasons. That might be because of their experiences. That might be because of what they've heard in the media. And that's understandable. Obviously, digital technology has taken over our lives in many ways. And I really appreciate the approach of, again, Richard Louv, where he says, he's not against digital technology. He's not against video games because these are part of our world and there's no point in shaming anybody for enjoying those things. Right. I mean, they have their value, they have their time and their place. I think one of the big concerns is how addictive a lot of these technologies are, and especially when it comes to social media, how they're deliberately addictive. And that's a whole other discussion that we
Sure.
can get into. But that's an important part of it, is that we have these pervasive digital tools that are designed to be addictive. And unsurprisingly, they really do hook people on them. And they're usually experienced indoors. So, I mean, there's so much contributing to it. And certainly the number of hours that the average young person spends outdoors is declining in a lot of ways. And
yeah,
hopefully
it's a sign of the times a bit, eh? Like just the changing world. It's amazing technology's speed of turnover, which always keeps, the next generation kind of going or up to date with the latest. It's hard to circumvent that sometimes, for sure. Ian, what are the kind of things on the Green Teacher? Like what can teachers find there? Like what are some things that they might, if they're looking for, kind of getting to know a little bit more about outdoor, what are some of your resources that you guys have to offer?
Yeah, so Green Teacher has 5 main channels of operations. So the quarterly magazine was really the entirety of Green Teacher for many decades. So Green Teacher started in the UK, actually, in 1986, over in Wales, and then opened a North American branch in 1991. And then that eventually became the entirety of Green Teacher. So it was this quarterly publication, which included insights, activities, and lesson plans related to environmental education. As the years went by, and my predecessors, Tim Grant and Gail Littlejohn, are to be commended for their foresight. They recognized that we needed to have some sort of digital presence. And, this is again why I say, I like Richard Louv, I'm not anti-digital. Right. I mean, we're using Zoom right now.
For sure.
This is a podcast, and these things all have their time and their place. So they foresaw the digital advancement of life and eventually onboarded the majority of Green Teacher's resources onto a resource portal that now is, I guess I kind of liken it as like a Netflix for educators. So it's organized by topic and age group. It's very easy to find what you need. It includes all the back issues of the magazine. A few years ago, actually, the magazine went fully digital. We do occasionally do special print runs, but for the most part, the magazine is fully digital. But more people access the Green Teacher subscription as access to the resource portal. So on demand, if I need a lesson for elementary school students about permaculture, you can find that in the resource portal quite easily with the vast archive of, I believe it's about 530 individual pieces, plus over 130 webinar recordings. So that's
right.
Really the heart of Green Teacher. And we do a number of webinars that are totally free. Those are throughout the year. We do some professional development. We're doing one right now in partnership with Natural Curiosity, the organization I mentioned earlier. And we also started a podcast of our own back in 2020. And we just recorded a few days ago, episode number 50. So that'll be going out. Talking
Congratulations.
With Teachers, which is available on all the regular podcast platforms. So it's a resource provider. The magazine/resource portal is subscription based. The PD is on demand, depending on school boards or districts that reach out to us. And then the webinars and the podcasts are totally free and open source. We've also done a number of books over the years. The 2 most recent ones are teaching kids about climate change and teaching teens about climate change. So toolkits for educators with ready-to-use activities and lesson plans on teaching about climate change, as the names would suggest.
You mentioned those 2 resources, like you have your elementary and then your high school. 2 very different beasts, right? I mean, elementary, high school, very different in mindset and approach. How would you bring the outdoors into a high school more? Because I've always noticed that it's a much harder pickup, I find, than in the elementaries, because they kind of already are starting to do a lot of outdoor stuff. But in high school, it seems it gets down to brass tacks, really, right? And just having to get through the program.
Hmm.
What have been some successes for you at the high school level of getting teachers to maybe bring their kids outside and using it as a classroom outside and discovery and exploration and all of that?
I think having a space that can be an integrating context for learning helps a lot. And this could take the form of an outdoor classroom. It might be the courtyard of a school. It might be a school garden. Maybe there's another green space. Maybe there's a wetland. And there's so much that you can do at these spaces. Now, it does help to have a bit of infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it does help to have a shelter. So if it is raining out, you have an overhead shelter that can keep you out of the rain. It helps to have things like sit pads, just
Right.
so that it's not as jarring a change to go from indoors where you're sitting at a desk on a chair to outdoors. You know, having a sit pad, you still have your own space as you do indoors, but you're still outdoors. It's just those little tools. So, I
Right.
mean, having the infrastructure like overhead shelters is great, but also those tools and resources
Right.
are incredibly useful. But yeah, I mean, some of the greatest successes are at sites like school gardens or restoration sites. And of course, I think the obvious connection is with science, but there are opportunities again across subject areas.
For
I mean,
sure.
just thinking about a school garden, there's so much you can do with storytelling because, you know, a garden, of course, isn't just the plants. It's who else is
Right.
coming to it.
Right.
You can put up a
Right.
bug hotel and attract all kinds of insects. You can do all kinds of mathematical activities, art, of course,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
really everything. Storytelling can be incorporated, moving downstream from what you're observing in that outdoor space. And there are certainly a lot of schools out there that are putting together these outdoor spaces, whether they're an outdoor classroom as such, depends on the site, but a site with some sort of learning infrastructure to make that transition from indoors to outdoors easier.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with you on that. And kind of something that you had mentioned at the start of this is seeing it all as one, right? All of your subject areas as a whole rather than these individual kind of components. Um, the sum makes up that whole, and it allows kids much more access when they can see it in through lots of different lenses.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very cool. Um, what are kind of wrap things up here, Ian? Again, thanks so much for joining me and just
Oh,
having a great chat. I've
my pleasure.
learned a ton of things too. Lots of reflection going on. Um, what's coming up down the pipe for the Green Teacher? What are some things that are on the agenda coming up that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, so we're really excited. In January, we'll be producing a special themed issue of the magazine that's dedicated to the energy transition with a particular focus on electrification and renewables. And one of the pieces in this magazine is specifically about envisioning a future where we do engage in deep decarbonization and make the right choices to switch our energy grid from one that's based in fossil fuels to one that's based in clean electricity, largely supported by renewables.
Hmm.
This is a really interesting topic that I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about and talking about with other folks. We do need to bring that future dimension into all learning, but certainly environmental learning. I mean, even the word environment often for a lot of people has a negative connotation, and that's totally understandable.
Hmm.
And especially if you just say environment, future, those two words together for a lot of people probably bring them a sense of dread or unknown. And that's reasonable. That's reasonable given what we know and the trajectory that we are on, albeit the worst case scenarios in terms of climate change, for the most part, look like they're off the table. Now, best case scenario, far from guaranteed. But what if we do reach the Paris targets, for example? What if we do get to the 1.5 degrees Celsius mark that we've heard so much about? What does that world look like? What does that future look like? What are the new opportunities in terms of lifestyle, in terms of food, in terms of transportation?
Right.
we need to be able to know what we're aiming toward.
Yep. I agree
We
with
know
you.
what we want to avoid. And that's really important to know that. So, books like The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, that has a really important place because that talks about worst case scenarios in terms of climate change. But what
Mhm.
do the better case scenarios? I probably shouldn't say best case, but better case scenarios. What do those
Sure.
look like? What does your
Mhm.
day to day look like? What are the opportunities? And that's going to be the center point of one of the articles. And it will include numerous educational activities to
Oh, fun.
allow educators for elementary, middle, and high school to explore the energy transition and electrification in an inquiry driven way and focusing mostly on the exciting opportunities. Not to
Yeah.
say that we shouldn't be worried about a lot of the negative situations that are still on the table,
Mhm.
but we do want to focus on what we could do if we get this right. Because it's a lot more motivating to say, I mean, this is, as people have said about Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, his speech was, I have a dream, not I have a nightmare.
Right. Right.
Um, I don't know who to attribute that particular quote to, but it certainly comes up a lot when we talk about future casting in a climate crisis.
For
What does the
sure.
dream look like as opposed to the nightmare? And I think that's a really important question. So we'll be
Hmm.
doing that with the winter issue of the magazine, and we will be distributing some print issues to school boards across Canada.
Awesome. That's great. It makes me, it reminds me of this quote too, that I think it's Richard Louv that said this as well, that you can't expect kids to um, take on climate change if you've never given them the opportunity to love nature, right? Or
Totally.
love the environment. And I think that just that idea is just, we've got to expose the kids more to these kinds of things so that they can start figuring out. Because in the end, it kind of gets pushed down the road as generations turn over. Um, and our youngest learners really need to kind of create an awareness of um, before we start saying, yeah, you guys are in charge of fixing the world that we messed up. Good luck. um, yeah. Well, thank you, Ian. This has been really amazing. It's been a great chat with you. I will definitely um, attach your websites and your information that you've shared
Great.
to this podcast. And good luck. I mean, I look forward to that, the new year and the new resources that are coming out.
For sure.
And we'll probably see each other down the road at some point.
Yeah, hopefully in person, at a conference or next time I'm in Quebec. We always like to find excuses to go to Quebec. Lots of good
Excellent.
reasons to visit some beautiful parts of the country over there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we'll stay in touch because maybe I can have you come in and we could do some workshops or something together down
That
the
sounds
road.
great.
So thanks, Ian Shanahan, the green teacher we've been chatting with today about all things environmental and life and how the world shifts. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Chris.
All right.